stalled Middle East peace negotiations, thanks to the tireless efforts of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry.
When this process started several months ago, there were very wide gaps, very significant gaps between the two sides. We have been able to narrow those gaps very significantly.
So none of this is happening in exactly leaps and bounds, rather more at a snail's pace. The two sides have agreed to meet and talk about talks to discuss reviving the peace negotiations. They hope to send top envoys to Washington as early as next week, possibly. Just getting to this point was no small feat. Secretary Kerry is navigating a variety of sticking points that have derailed talks in the past. The 67 borders, the ongoing Israeli settlement building on the West Bank, and Palestinian prisoners. Now, Israel says it will release some of them, people who they've described as heavyweight, who've been in prison for more than 10 years. But that still leaves, of course, the larger issues to be addressed, the status of Jerusalem, the fate of Palestinian refugees around the world. And skepticism is, of course, as always, sky high, that this go-round would produce that elusive peace deal. But just talks themselves may be crucial, if indeed they happen, because using history as a judge, there's usually less violence when a peace process is underway, and there's usually more chance of progress when the United States is fully engaged. Now, I managed to speak with Israel's lead negotiator, she's Justice Minister Tzipi Livni. I talked to her earlier this evening from Jerusalem, just before a US-imposed gag order goes into effect on the two sides. Minister Tzipi Livni, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So clarify for us, are you on your way to Washington? Are these talks about talks actually going to happen this week?
Well, I'm here in Jerusalem, but I truly hope that in the next few days we can meet with the Palestinians and, of course, by the invitation of Secretary Kerry, who really was amazing here, bridge gaps, and I truly hope that our dream and aspiration to negotiate in order to end the conflict can be translated into real meetings, real dialogue, and hopefully in the end, ending of conflict.
But I hear that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs to have the whole cabinet approve this process. Has that happened yet?
No, not yet. Listen, it's not a secret that in Israel we have different opinions. And also within the cabinet, within the government, we have parties that it's more problematic for them to support the process. But yet, I hope and I do believe that we can have the majority in the Israeli government to support this. I believe that this is the interest of Israel, but of course we have different opinions in the Israeli cabinet.
Obviously, the Israeli position is that there must be no preconditions. I assume you're still staying with that position. And I want to ask you what your reaction is to some on the Palestinian side who say that there must be at least an agreement on the 67 borders as a basis of negotiations before this process starts.
Christian, you know, the last thing that I want to do now is to do something that both of us, or both sides, agreed with Secretary Kerry. I'm not going to relate publicly to the terms of the understanding that we reached with the United States and the United States with the Palestinians and vice versa. The whole idea is that to build trust and confidence, and not to enter into this blame game that we used to have in the last years.
Well, let's talk then a little bit about what might come up. Obviously, there's so many issues. The idea of settlement activity.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, that the EU, the European Union, has passed measures that say there can be no funding for any activities in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. That has obviously put some pressure on Israel. Is that one of the reasons why you're coming to the table, or why you think now is the time is right? Why do you think the time is right to come to the table now?
I believe that the time was right also years ago. I support deeply not only the idea of negotiations, but the idea of the need to end the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. This is an Israeli interest. It's not a favor to the Palestinians, not to the EU, and not even to the President of the United States. It is our own interest, and this is the reason that the idea of relaunching the negotiation is not because of a pressure or because of a favor or doing something for the sake of others. It is the interest of Israel. Talking about the EU, the good news is what they announced today, and this is that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. So having their new release on the new instructions to the EU organization is something that they published last week, but it's going to be implemented just in a few months from now. So we are going to work with the EU in order to change this, because it doesn't contribute to negotiations, because the future of the Israeli borders and the Palestinian borders need to be agreed in the negotiations room and not by the EU.
What about the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu, I assume, wants a better relationship with the United States? Is this one reason to go to talks, to have a better relationship with the Obama administration in order to have, more sort of cordial entente on other issues such as Iran or other such things down the road?
You know something, it's not only the interest of Israel and the relations with the United States, which are very important to us in Israel from a strategic point of view. It's not just a matter of same values and interest, but it is really a relationship that are important for us to keep. But you can see that minutes after Secretary Kerry announced about the invitation and that both sides agreed to come and negotiate, those that opposed this declaration, it was Hamas in the Palestinian Authority, those that are not fighting for the creation of a new state, but they are fighting against the existence of the State of Israel, Iran, Jihad Islamic. So basically, by relaunching the negotiations, we can reform different groups in this region. On one hand, we have the extremists, we have Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and on the other, we have a group of pragmatics that now, by relaunching the negotiations with the support of the Arab League, we can have the same camp of moderate acting against those that are using terror and are not accepting not only the right of Israel to exist, but they are fighting the values and the interests that the United States represent in the region. So yes, it's a mutual goal. It's the same interest between Israel and the United States, but it's more than that.
Well, let me ask you about your next-door neighbor, Egypt, with whom you do have a peace treaty. How has the change of government there, the toppling of the elected president, Mohamed Morsi, and now this interim government, heavily influenced by the military, how does that affect the dynamic of your relations with Egypt and on this peace process, if it ever gets underway?
You know, the good news is that having peace between Israel and Egypt is something that, since we have this for so many years, any changes until now in the Egyptian presidency and government doesn't affect the peace treaty, because they understand as well that this is their own interest. And the last thing that I want as an Israeli, or as an Israeli minister, I truly don't want to relate to the internal situation in Egypt or Syria or other of our neighbors that internally are in terms of changes and troubles and all this stuff. Because I don't want the extremists there or elsewhere using any statement coming from Israel in order to say, you see, Israel is involved in the internal situation in Egypt. So the wise thing to do is to be silent now.
And you're being very silent, very, very professionally. Tzipi Livni, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we'll hear from a Palestinian representative tomorrow.